this episode, I'll be discussing cannabis legalization in America. Where exactly were we before and leading up to coronavirus? How did the pandemic completely change everything? And where do we go from here? For the purposes of this video, I'm going to refer to pre-coronavirus era as cutting off at the beginning of March 2020. Please do not take this as either a pro-legalization or anti-legalization video. Also, this episode will not go into cannabis use in and of itself or from a public health standpoint just yet. That'll be another video. If you were someone who wanted cannabis to be recreationally legal, then 2020 was positioned to be a monumental year. Support for cannabis legalization nationally was growing by the poll. A poll of 10,000 American adults taken from Pew Research Center in September 2019 found that 67% of respondents believe the country should legalize cannabis, 5% higher than last year. And this vast support was supposed to bring momentum for major change. First, there was the Secure and Fair Enforcement Banking Act, or the SAFE Banking Act. The goal of this bill was to officially allow cannabis businesses to open accounts with national financial institutions like banks. It passed the House of Representatives easily by a vote of 321 to 103 in September 2019, but still has not been called for a vote in the Senate. Then there was the Marijuana Opportunity and Reinvestment and Expungement Act, or the MORE Act, co-introduced by former presidential candidate Kamala Harris. Its goals were to fully decriminalize cannabis federally, expunge prior cannabis-related convictions off criminal records, creating a 5% tax revenue fund for grants that would go for job training and re-entry services for persons with convictions and in low-income communities, and support for small, minority-owned cannabis businesses. The topics of reinvestment and expungement are extremely important, so they deserve their own videos. But this act was approved by the House Judiciary Committee in November and was scheduled for a hearing in January. And while the MORE Act isn't seen as having a great chance at ultimately passing, the fact that a federal cannabis decriminalization bill is sponsored by a former presidential candidate was still pretty monumental for that time. It also can't be ignored that up until the beginning of March, Senator Bernie Sanders was the frontrunner for being the Democratic Party's presidential nominee. He had just won the first 3 primaries pretty resoundingly, and he arguably had the most liberal cannabis policies out of the entire Democratic contest. And changes surrounding cannabis policy were actually happening faster on the state level. It was fully recreationally legal in 11 states and the District of Columbia, decriminalized for possession in 16 states in the Virgin Islands, and medicinally legal in 33 states and DC. And out of the 17 states in which medicinal is not legal, CBD is legal in 14 of those states. The 3 most prohibited states are Idaho, South Dakota, and Nebraska. And in Nebraska's case, a person will not be charged for their first cannabis offense. Votes for recreational were being openly discussed by state legislatures in Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and New Mexico. Virginia was discussing decriminalizing it, and medicinal cannabis was being discussed or expanded for allowed medical conditions in Ohio, South Dakota, Missouri, and Alabama. So leading up to February, 2020 definitely seemed poised to be a year of sweeping change across the country. Now, what I think makes the coronavirus's impact on cannabis legalization so interesting is that in some ways it hindered attempts for progress, but in other ways it actually propelled it. First, it halted legislatures. Federal, state, and local. Priorities changed. State governments had to completely shift their focus on the medical and later financial havoc. Calls to legalize and decriminalize cannabis were replaced with begs to ensure proper medical supplies and personnel and to make sure their constituents were staying home. It's home for no one like it does for New Yorkers. Governor Andrew Cuomo was determined for months to pass recreational legalization in New York, and his plan was to account for cannabis tax revenue as part of the state's 2021 fiscal budget. That budget was scheduled to be approved on April 1st. Yet with just 2 weeks remaining, coronavirus shifted his and lawmakers' attention, and he was not able to iron out the details of legalization before that date. 2 weeks. It also shut down pro-cannabis advocacy efforts. Campaigns in Arizona, North Dakota, Missouri, and Idaho to include questions about legalization in their 2020 election ballots were canceled because they were no longer allowed to seek signatures outside per the stay-at-home orders. But something else is happening. Recreationally legal states are reporting dramatic increases in sales. Oregon reported 89 million in April 2020, a 45% increase from April 2019. Ohio's medicinal sales were up in March 2020. On average, recreational sales in California, Colorado, and Alaska were up 50% year over year for the month of April. And 8 of the 11 recreational states have designated cannabis dispensaries to be essential businesses. We know that where cannabis is legal, recreationally or medicinally, the number of transactions are increasing, and the average revenue by singular sale is also increasing. A separate video will address the health implications of this. The states with legal cannabis are getting these high 8-figure cash windfalls that none of them could have predicted or accounted for in any previously projected quarterly or annual budget. And it is inevitable that lawmakers all across the country at all levels are noticing, especially at a time where states are in need of and the federal government is giving unprecedented amounts of money. So where does the issue of legalization in America go from here? Upcoming November election is an undeniably powerful variable. One of my upcoming episodes will compare the 2 presidential candidates based on their drug policy stances. But even aside from that, some of the state ballots will include measures on progressing the cannabis policies with the same yes or no answer option. South Dakota actually succeeded in getting enough in-person signatures for its ballot to feature questions on both legalizing recreational and medicinal cannabis, which is remarkable because South Dakota is one of the 3 states in which CBD is illegal without prescription. New Jersey and Mississippi are able to go through with their legalization measures as well for their ballots. So whether some other states like Arizona and Idaho's campaigns were shut down, you have to wonder, could the pandemic become a source of pro-cannabis support in the states that are able to push their referendums through? And on a legislative note, aside from the SAFE and MORE Acts mentioned earlier, the designation of cannabis businesses as essential during the pandemic in legal states has created momentum by proposing the Emergency Cannabis Small Business Health and Safety Act, which would allow dispensaries to gain access to the Small Business Administration's Relief Fund. And while that may not point directly to legalization, cannabis businesses receiving aid from the federal government would definitely still be symbolically a noteworthy milestone. Thanks for listening, guys. If you have any questions you'd like answered, suggestions, or feedback, you can email me at alldrugnews@gmail.com or direct message me on Instagram at alldrugnews. Thanks, guys. See you next time.